Good morning, Professor Traversa. Thank you for participating in this mock session of the Jean Monnet Network on EU-China relations, and specifically about your work on the role of taxation in the EU-China relationship. First of all, we would like to ask you, what are the main current drivers of EU foreign tax policy?
Yes, at the moment, the EU is developing its competencies in the area of tax policy. It's a rather new phenomenon because for decades, EU tax policy was more centered on member states, the internal market, cross-border economic activities between member states, for example, harmonizing value-added taxation and other indirect taxes, or adopting some directives in the area of corporate tax as regards cross-border flows of payments such as dividends or interest, or improving administrative tax cooperation between the tax authorities of the member states. But things have been changing in the last years because taxation is a global phenomenon. The EU has been more and more collaborating with other international organizations, in particular the OECD, and also a number of EU policies now have a clear international dimension. So when I say it's new, it's not totally new because for a long time now, the EU is a customs union, and custom duties are taxes, and of course, custom duties policy is part of the external trade policy. But besides custom duties, the EU had never before undertaken any significant steps as regards external tax policy, at least before the year 2000. It started with international tax cooperation, with the directive on the harmonization of the taxation of savings, interest in the form of savings, where the EU had to negotiate for the first time with third countries like Switzerland, Andorra, Monaco, and others. But that was a small parenthesis until today, because the EU has been implementing now for 6-7 years political compromises at the OECD level, whether the ATAD directive and more recently Pillar 2, and Pillar 2, well, has a very strong international dimension. And now the question is, will the EU, besides negotiating almost on behalf of, or at least together, but in some sense on behalf of the member state within the OECD, will the EU will take additional steps by starting to negotiate directly with very important trading partners of the OECD, of the European Union, like the United States, on the implementation of a mechanism like Pillar 2. Another dimension which is less known than Pillar 2, but very significant, is the fact that the EU, for the first time some years ago, 3-4 years ago, has adopted, negotiated a convention, a bilateral convention with Norway in the area of administrative cooperation and in VAT. And that's the first international tax instrument which is signed by the EU together with the member state, but by EU institution in the area of taxation. So that clearly shows that the EU is moving towards a more internationally oriented policy, and not to mention a very recent development, which is also part not only of tax policy, but environmental tax policy, the CBAM, and the fact that now the EU has decided to adopt an instrument that would tax with a very peculiar mechanism, but would tax the import of goods, of some types of goods at the border, if those goods have been produced in countries that do not meet environmental standards that are comparable to the European one. So that's a new door, and probably we have to expect many more developments in the area of international environmental tax policy.
Thank you very much for your answer. Secondly, to what extent China could be a partner of the EU in the area of taxation?
So China is a very important partner of the EU in the area of trade, and that will, it's of course that will have also some tax implications. So trade, because China is home of big multinationals now who are exporting goods throughout the world, including to the EU, and those goods are subject to European taxes, and in particular VAT. So it seems clear that in the future, the EU will have to deal with China as regards the implementation of VAT rules for goods imported from China. There has been important developments as regards the taxation of e-commerce, and in particular at the administrative level, the possibility for importers to use the one-stop shop system, which implies strong cooperation between the importer and at least one tax administration of one member state, but that will require, for that system to work, to have some type of cooperation with the local tax authorities of the home country of those importers, which may be Chinese. So on VAT, we certainly expect some cooperation. In the area of direct taxation too, China has a number of bilateral treaties in the area of income taxes with member states. We do not expect in the near future to have one single European EU-China tax treaty, but at the level of administrative cooperation, we could imagine some type of a common EU framework. If we look, for example, at the implementation at the EU level of some OECD standards of exchange of information, well, it wouldn't be unreasonable to have some common position from the EU when negotiating with China about exchange of banking information for tax matters. We also expect cooperation from China, between China and the EU at the environmental level. China and the EU have been considered themselves as competitors in the economic area, but certainly when dealing with fighting climate change, China and the EU have more to gain to consider them partners, because they are clearly on the same planet, on the same boat. And the EU is adopting a number of instruments that are directly targeting goods from third countries, including China. And China is also adopting its own Green Deal, although at a slower pace than the EU. China will make significant investments in the area of environmental policy, and there may be also a tax dimension to that. A simple example is, for example, as regards the implementation of CBAM, so this mechanism at the border adopted by the EU for some types of goods that do not meet environmental standards. Well, it would be necessary to negotiate with China to see whether Chinese environmental policy in the area of CO2 taxation is similar to what's happening at the EU level or in the EU member states, and that would require some type of negotiation, but not simply to control what China is doing, but to make sure that both partners are moving towards the same objective of reducing CO2 emission. We are also expecting some cooperation between China and the EU as regards those global compromises that have been adopted at the OECD level, in particular Pillar 2, maybe also Pillar 1 as regards the taxation of multinational companies, because Chinese companies, as all multinational companies, could be impacted by those measures, including on the EU territory. So it would be necessary to have some kind of negotiation in that area. And finally, China has been very active as regards some countries in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has also a tax dimension. And it's important that the EU is able to match that type of initiative with some third countries.
Finally, we would like to ask you, what are the potential obstacles to further develop tax cooperation between the EU and China?
And the potential obstacles between EU and China in order to develop a fruitful cooperation in the area of taxation is, first of all, diversity. Not only, of course, within the EU, tax systems are very diverse, and it's more difficult, of course, for the EU as such to be able to develop a cooperation with China, with other member state in all areas of taxation, but also diversity between China and the EU as regards the tax systems, as regards the legal system. China does not have the same structure as regards the economy, does not have the same type of relationship between tax authorities and private taxpayers, does not work according the same standards, whether a rule of law or taxpayer rights, and therefore it's not that easy to start from the scratch a cooperation with partners that has different values as regards policy and organization of the tax system. Democracy and rule of law is embedded in the European treaties, in the European Constitution, and have a direct impact on the relationship between taxpayers and tax authorities. It is not the same in China, so it's an important element to take into account. Other obstacles could be differences in objectives as regards foreign tax policies. The EU is quite attached to the idea of multilateralism, of making sure that there is a number of international rules that allow some kind of fair redistribution of the tax base between all the countries that are part to the process. China sees its external tax policy as a part of its economic policy, and in particular the Belt and Road Initiative. It's very clear from the fact that China has created some years ago its own international organization in the area of tax, which is called BRITACOM, which is the Belt and Road Tax Initiative Tax Authorities Forum, with a number of events, with a large number of countries that are participating to the conferences, and that are basically the countries that are partners of China in the Belt and Road Initiative. And the objective is to make sure that, let's say, the tax framework, the international tax framework between China and those countries serves the purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative. But this is an initiative whose goal is only a goal which is personal to China to a certain extent, which is to ensure that China may export its products in the various parts of the world, and that China also may import some much needed, for example, natural resources of other products it needs to continue its industrial development. And it's difficult to imagine that the EU could be a partner of China in order to develop the Belt and Road Initiative, since it's a program that is only built by China. It does not necessarily serve the interest of the EU. So if there is a cooperation in the area of taxation between China and the EU, it should be on other bases than simply having the EU be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not something that is seriously contemplated. The Belt and Road Initiative has also other dimensions. For example, Chinese investments in the concerned countries, which has been an object of controversies within the European Union, and which is currently the object of negotiation within Europe between European member states in order to avoid too much foreign investment of that nature on the territory of the European Union. So that could also create some frictions, which is not directly tax related, but frictions between China and the EU in building some new type of cooperation in the area of taxation.
Thank you very much again for participating in this project. It has been a pleasure, Professor.
My pleasure too.